Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Gabriella Beckles-Raymond, and this is the first episode of Breaking Bread, a series of conversations hosted by the Black Thought Collective. The aim of these conversations is to provide food for thought that whets the appetite for collective imagination and action. Today we'll be looking at thought, what it is, what it means to us, what it can do for us, and what are its limits. For episode 1, we're going to kick things off with half of our collective. You'll hear from the second half in episode 2. So joining me today, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce post-colonial theologian, senior lecturer and cultural critic, Dr. Gifford Rhamie, choreographer, arts practitioner, lecturer and theorist, Dr. H. Patten, and economist and educator, Philip Beckles-Raymond. So let's get into it. I want to start with a couple of quotes to set the scene for the discussion. In Erykah Badu's classic On and On, she has a lyric that states, "The man who knows something knows that he knows nothing at all." We might call this a remix of the so-called Socratic paradox, "I know that I know nothing," which I'm compelled to note Socrates never actually said. Then there's the late great Muhammad Ali, who said, "What you're thinking is what you're becoming." In these expressions, we see both the humility great thought demands and the profound power of thought. So I want to kick off by asking the panel, when you hear the word thought, thinking, what does it mean to you?
Perhaps I can jump in. And begin with saying what I used to think thought was. So much of my life, I would say, I thought of thought as something that is evidence-based, something that is observable, something that is tested, something that you imagine on the basis of concrete precedents, and I figured that was really scientific thought,
right?
But really, in my own education, I felt that was the substance of thought. That thought was really a means of scientifically conceptualizing something, and. But latterly, in the past number of years, as I discovered more about the idea of epistemology and so on, it suddenly occurred to me that thought is a lot more than that. That thought is not one-dimensional or two-dimensional, but thought is interconnected. So I like to think of thought as something that embraces the different domains in which we live, whether it be the intellectual domain, the social domain, the physical domain, or material domain, or spiritual domain. And I think these knowledges, if you like, are interconnected and holistic as one. And that's how I will kick off my own contribution to this discussion, by just suggesting that thought very much for me is something that's fairly holistic. I could say more on that later, I guess.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in?
Okay, well, I'll come in and say something. But I just want to say, when I say open your mouth, just answer, Tory, jump out. Open your mouth.
Story jump out.
Yeah, so when you open your mouth, a story jump out. And all stories begin with thoughts. And so the whole idea of thinking and thought, for me, similar to Gifford, when we talk about thinking and thought, the first thing that used to come to me, especially from a youth, was the idea of thought being something that's big and great and important. The powerful people are the ones that have real thought, and the rest of us follow. And as an artist, from an artistic point of view, whenever people mention thinking and thought, immediately I think of the artist Rodin and the sculpture called The Thinker, the one where you think like this. And this is where I always thought, so yes, it's about power, because sculpture is very powerful in terms of the arts, but also it's about hierarchy, because you have the notion of high art, and then as an artist particularly, involved in dance as well. People tend to look at dance more as a cultural expression, and so this notion of high art, low culture. And so there's the idea that knowledge is about hierarchy. And so when you look at the academy, it's about elitism and those who can become part of the elite, aspiring to that. And those who can't make it as part of the elite remain. And so for me, it then brings me to the notion of Garvey. What Garvey says, he says, with confidence, you have won even before you begin, before you have started. And so the whole idea of thought and thinking made me used to think that wasn't for me. Thought was something that the great people do. But then as I grew up moving around Rastas, I found out that many Rastas were some of the greatest philosophers I've ever heard. And also with thought and thinking is about empowerment. And so it goes right back to Garvey again when he says that people without the knowledge of their past history, their origins and culture, is like a tree without a root. That is what I now bring to thought and thinking. We have to all think. We have to have thought in order that we'll have knowledge.
You know, I'm listening to this and I really like the way that Gifford and H come in on this, because the idea of thought being holistic, you know, that Gifford mentions here, and then H, you bring in the idea of power. For me, I started off thinking about thought. Firstly, it struck me how much I don't think about thought. I think, but I don't think about thought, right? But when you think about it, to me, it comes into the idea of being human. And I think then about this idea of geographies of reason, right? Who gets to be human and therefore gets to be thinking. And thought being, you know, going to school to tell you, pronounce your THs well. It's one of those words you have to pronounce well. Thought. You don't just say, I thought it was 3 o'clock, you know. You say thought, you know, because there's something formalized about it. And you start getting into who's the thinker and who gets to think, you know. And so for me, when I think of thought, when I think of being human, it then circles back like a trade wind for me back to, well, we have to think of what it means to be human to uncover what thought is. And I want to look at it in a very holistic way in terms of thought being that host of creativity, you know, an expression of being human. So everything from written word that gets the primacy of thought, the thought of this person or that person, to feelings, you know, there's a gender angle going on there, to geographies of reason, again, I go back, race and stuff that tells us what is thought, who gets to think. So for me, it's a sort of a idea of being human that then invokes things like tradition, because you get, when you go back to what our humanity takes us to, thought takes us way back into how thought was actually expressed and the vessels through which it came, you know. So for me, when I think of thought, I think of tradition, I think of change, I think of creativity, you know. Most importantly for me, the uncovering of thought, I think of freedom.
Right. So let me ask you, because you've all kind of touched on thought in this, well, kind of transitions in your own thinking about thought, obviously, but also this idea of the way power and hierarchy plays into thought and how we typically as Black people do not fit the imagery of the thinker. When people are talking about thinking, it's that, like H was saying, those classical images, or it's the image of, you know, Einstein with the gray hair and the glasses. So for those of us who don't fit that phenotypical description, that obviously impacts our experiences of thought and what it means to be a thinker. And so before we jump to the kind of next segment, I want to ask you to, if you could please talk a little bit about thinking about this transition, what some of your early experiences of education as thinkers were there? Did you feel the impact of that hierarchy that you've all talked about personally?
I mean, for me, I come from a very classical theological world. The discipline of biblical studies is a very Eurocentric discipline, and takes in classical philosophy and classical notions of what history is, and therefore classical notions of what thought is. And I will always remember when I was being trained, when I was doing my degrees, how efficient the lecturers were in getting us to process the text, the written text, for example, as an artifact, as a photograph. It's a photograph that you can parse. It's a photograph that you can dissect into different parts, and only as we dissect it into different parts can we get a full understanding of what the text is. And I remember finding that problematic, because to me that didn't tell the whole story. Right. Of course, the text is what we have, but I then asked myself, well, suppose the text moved? Suppose there's motion in the text. Suppose we see the text as a motion picture rather than a photograph. What then do we see? And then that flags up other different kinds of notions of knowledge, doesn't it? Right, because all of a sudden you're looking at intuitiveness, you're looking at impressions, you're looking at the emotional responses, you're looking at different ways of understanding identity, and so on and so forth. And really that was my transition, the actual realization that the text in front of me can actually move. It's like a motion picture. It's not necessarily like a stilled photograph. And just imagining that way took a while for me to get used to be fair, because I was so structured in a particular rudimentary way of parsing everything. And but suddenly I'm now told that there's something behind the text that perhaps is motivating the text, and is perhaps gives you more than what the text is actually giving you. And then you think, oh well, I now have to ask different sets of questions in order to get into what the storyline is saying. So that was one example of my own transition.
Okay.
Well, I think for me, it's interesting what Gifford was saying about the text and if the text is moving, because at one point text was about the words and the written word, and what's spoken. And there was a Jamaican scholar, Rhamie, who spoke about her experience when she went to the United States to go and study. She was a dancer, and in her class they actually said that there's nothing about Caribbean dance, and in the Caribbean they don't have spectacular dance. Dance is purely functional. And she put up her hand and said, well, excuse me, she comes from Jamaica. She said, I'm from Jamaica, and I know that when I was dancing, I was doing spectacular dance. And the tutor asked her, where is it written about? And she didn't have an answer at that time, because this was in the 60s. And she said, well, there isn't much written on it. And he said, well, if it's not written about, then it doesn't exist. And so she said, oh, and she made it her duty to go back to Jamaica, and she started to write, and she encouraged other people to write, so that we write the history. But I think as Black people, we also have to realize that thought isn't just recorded on paper. It's not just written words. We record it through our bodies. That's why, in terms of my own researching into Jamaican dancehall, I looked at not the written history, but the history that was inscribed within the body. What is the history that the body tells us? And how do we connect? How do we connect with Trinidad through the body? The whining shows that there's a connection there. There's something about the whining that is more than just something sexual, because it couldn't be every one of us doing sexualized movement. It's because behind the whining is the whole idea and thought system and worldview, where it's part of the circle of life, without beginning, without end. There's no hierarchy. All of us are equal within it. And that's what is conjured up in thought when we start to look at the whining. And that is why we start to connect across the different areas of the diaspora. And so coming back to the idea of thought, we have always had thought, but we have recorded it in alternative ways, and we have passed it down in a way that it lives and it remains functional and purposeful. And when it no longer serves a purpose, we allow it to stagnate and die.
Right.
So I'm thinking here about thought as a thing in itself and the value of thought, almost as if thought is some crystallized image of thinking, one being alive, the other one being almost captured, and captured for the purpose of giving value. And so I'm just running in my head a sort of a exploitation model of, if you commoditize thought, you assign it value that can then be exchanged. Well, thought that doesn't have value almost stops being thought. It stops being validated as thought. And so I think of what we value as thought almost creates an alternative paradigm for us, right? So like H is talking about the arts altogether, moving text means you create different, I wouldn't say markets for, but different spaces in which thought value could be exchanged, And I think it really goes to the heart of what happens with thought and power,
Right.
And even in the education space, I think, so I'm in my mind here thinking, can I teach someone to think? And I don't think it's the same thing as teaching someone to think critically, for example. That's a way of thinking. But to teach someone how to be human, if we think thought to be being human, is a strange kind of dangerous science, right? Because here you are, and I'm telling you how to think. Well, it's a bit audacious in a sense, So it's quite interesting to think of the idea of thought as an object, as opposed to thinking.
And that kind of dichotomy that you're really talking about, that's coming through in what you all are saying, is really this Platonic split of mind and body, right? Where thought becomes something that's done in the mind as opposed to something that's done in the body. And you get this disruption of, really, as you've all spoken to, a kind of holistic understanding of thought. But also, as you said, H, it really means that, and I'm sure we've all kind of had this experience at some point in time, where there becomes this other dichotomy where there are those people who think and those people who take action. And that kind of severing of thought from action becomes problematic, because if you're taking action, you're not a thinker. And if you're a thinker, then you're a waste of space and you're not doing anything, And so thinking about that kind of dichotomy that in some senses we want to resist, and we talked about thought being an embodied practice that's functional and designed to take action. How do you see thought, or the act of thinking, and I'm talking here in this broad sense that you all have talked about, being significant in how it can help us cope with this craziness of COVID-19 that we're all dealing with in our various ways at the moment? How can thought help us through these strange and difficult times?
It's an interesting question you bring up, Gabby, because in the context of COVID, for me, one of the biggest things that comes up is this idea of, a loss of connection, right? And if we jump off from thought being what it means to be human, as I'm suggesting here, this removal of connectedness and what seems to be a swapping out of connection for communication really brings up a question for me of can you have digital thought? Is thought really an analog thing? Or to put a sort of turn of phrase on it, really, for me, I question whether, the resistance in this space is to be human and to connect in ways that really resist a digitizing of thought. I don't even know what that would look like, but I think it doesn't strike me as human. I don't know what others think about it.
I think Philip is right, because from my perspective, when you think about COVID now and the separation of individuals, there has been a lot of, although we are isolating, in reality, it becomes a physical and a psychological isolation where individuals now feel disconnected from the human race itself. And so therefore, a lot of people are talking about the fallout that's going to come in terms of people's mental health. And this is because when you start to look at the whole situation of COVID now, it's forced us to be on our own, thinking on our own, but not having anybody to bounce the ideas off, and not having the community. And when I talk about community, I'm talking about the physical community, and I'm talking about the spiritual community now as well. And so the connection of everything together isn't there, and that's what will create the problem. And I think that's why many of us within the Black community were better placed to deal with individual isolation, because we still have some kind of spiritual connection. But then at the same time, when we're doing it through the digital space, we don't feel the same energy that you get when you're in the same physical space.
I think that's brilliant. I two things I would say. One is I can see how it is social distancing, especially psychological distancing, but it's really moreover physical distancing that impacts the social, the spiritual, and the mental, and so on. That's one response. But another response towards this whole, towards thought as being holistic, whether embodied, whether thought of as in terms of human, or what is humanity, or just using the notion of holism. I've always, this peculiar period that we're in, to some extent is foreign to me, but in another way it's not. And that's when I walk on the street normally, when people hold on to their bags, they cross the other side of the road, people are socially distancing from that. And I've grown up all my years with people doing that, and to the extent that it's actually normal. It's normal for people. And I sometimes notice it and I laugh. Other times I don't even notice it anymore. Okay. Now and what this has done is really uncovered or revealed or exposed the potholes in our own cultural thinking of what thought is, of what the holistic thinking is, of what human thought is. That thought is to be human. And people are beginning to, I think, question their own cultural mores around this notion of what does it actually mean to be human as constitutive of thought. And I think it's worth our discussion. Thankfully my mother, who's in her 80s, and dad, they're both in their 80s, they have an iPad, so we talk to them every day and so on and so forth. And it's strange not being able to communicate with her and so on. But then on the other hand, the fact that people, because of their marginal identities have been for years in this British society been social distanced because of their marginality, I think is something to actually flag up and to take serious note of.
Yeah, and you've really made me think actually of Orlando Patterson, the great Jamaican intellectual, where he talks about racism being a kind of social death, essentially, and we all know what that experience means if you're living in Britain. And so it really raises the question that you've kind of all touched on in different ways about the role of community in thinking, and can you have a thought, or what does thought mean if you're by yourself, right? And as we're talking about not just the kind of intellectual mind notion of thought, but these spiritual and embodied notions as well. It's kind of like if the tree falls down in the forest, does it really fall? And so in that community sense, there's often the kind of claim leveled against us, sometimes by some people in our community, I've heard this at least, where people say, oh, you're thinking too much, you're being too intellectual about it. And I understand the claim of over intellectualizing things, but do you think that there is such a thing as overthinking if we're looking at this expansive notion of thought? And what does it mean to overthink? Is that charge a fair one? You're thinking too much. Are there times where thought just isn't enough?
I think, I as a theologian, I do go to church, and often the collectivity of church is seen as a moment for rejoicing, for being happy, for praising, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And there's often little opportunity in the service to actually just stop and listen and to reflect and think. And sometimes I find it quite overwhelming when we're just in this jubilant atmospheric moment that's 2 hours, sometimes even 3. Help us. And there's and people go up. You start on a high and you finish on a high, and there's little time for reflection. What's happening now is that I find across my own spiritual community is that people are having to just sit with their own thoughts for the first time in a long while, and to just reflect on life generally and their own purpose as an individual, and how that pans out vis-a-vis other relations that they have. And I think this is a real struggle for some people who come from a context where everything has to be optimistic and everything has to be on a high all the time. I think that can be quite challenging. But then again, the question that you pose really speaks to some extent to personalities, doesn't it? Because some people are just
I think I understand what Gifford is saying, and I agree to a certain extent, but I disagree to another extent, because I remember I grew up in the church as well, but as an artist, as a choreographer and a dancer. I remember even from when I was young, I loved the dancing and the music and the singing, and I remember at those moments when you're singing a chorus and you're beginning to get mesmerized, singing it over and over again. It was at that time I would start to think about where I am, who I am, what good I can do, what bad I've done. And sometimes I used to even say to myself, well, if I'm to go, now is the moment for me to go, where I'm washed completely clean and free. And if I go now, I know exactly that I'll be going to heaven. That was my thinking within that space. But
thinking in the body, thinking in the body. I like that.
Yes. But also, I find that that when you talk about the overthinking from a dancer's perspective, overthinking shows where thinking can sometimes block you, because it blocks the fluency. It blocks spontaneity. It even blocks the spirit sometimes when the spirit want to lead you. Sometimes you have to allow your body to respond and to be guided. And sometimes we use thought to block us because we think we have to be led by thought at all times. But just like how in music and dance, sometimes the drummer plays a break and the dancer breaks, and another time a dancer breaks and the musician follows. That is the relationship between the material body and the spiritual world, and that's what makes us what I call the corporeal dancing body. Right. Where the two come together and where it's guided and led on a call and response kind of basis.
You know, it's really interesting here. I think, Gabby, the question you're asking has a lot to do with, to me, a split that's qualitative and quantitative. So when I think of overthinking, it's almost like a too much question. How much thought is involved? But often to me, it seems like it's a conflation with misguided thought.
Yes.
Because if your values are right, and if you're thinking the right thing, you can't be thinking too much. You know, there's no, you can't have too much ideas. But if you're thinking or talking rubbish, it starts to feel onerous or burdensome, and we could have a little pause on that,
But Philip,
yes,
there's a point to what H said, though, isn't there? Where sometimes it's useful to just stop thinking
in a particular way. So for me, if the music take me, right, I must not stop thinking. I must stop thinking about a particular type of thing like control or how to respond to the impulse, maybe mentally. But if I think of my holistic mind, maybe the way to respond to the impulse is to think with my arm or my waist. We talk about whining earlier, right? But if all that is thought, I'm thinking thought as a host of creativity. You know what I mean? So
if we're taking thought out of the head.
Yes.
Right.
I just wanted to bring up a point, Gabby, that you mentioned before on the COVID-19 thing, if I might. Because what comes to mind here for me is this idea of battery chickens, right? We sit down because work has been stopped insofar as it can't be socially distanced, right? But people are working from home. So the knowledge worker is still being exploited, is the point, right? And value is still being extracted. So I'm trying to think, well, if I take my analogy further on this battery chicken that gets injected to grow up faster.
Yes.
Are they trying to fast forward my knowledge production without, so now I can't be caught in traffic to arrive to work late? You know what I mean? The battery chicken, I just had to sit down and produce. So and maybe this might be overthinking, but I'm starting to, I don't know.
Well, I think it's a good point because I'm going to forget who said it, but in many ways, white collar work is the new kind of slavery. It's information age slavery.
All right.
And what we're really seeing and what you're touching on there is the question of what's the relationship between thought and other aspects of our life and other dimensions of our life, right? Where the knowledge worker, as you kind of talked about before, is paid to produce a kind of knowledge. But if we really take knowledge as a state of being, as a as fundamental to our existence, it then gives rise to questions about, well, what's the relationship between knowledge as we understand it and other aspects of our life?
Well, I think Gabby has touched on something because, for example, during this whole COVID period, I know there have been people who have caught the virus, and when they catch the virus, they're ringing up the emergency services, they're ringing up doctors, trying to find out what they should do, how they should react, what medicines to buy, etc. And nobody knows for sure because it's a new virus. But then I know there's other people who think back to other situations that have been similar,
Right.
and what are some of the old-time remedies.
Yes.
And now use the traditional knowledge in order to inform what is going on now. And I know that even within a household that's very close to me, I know that there was the mother got sick and she used the traditional remedies and she came through it. It didn't take full hold of her. The daughter was a doctor. She got sick, and because she was relying on the Western concept, it really took a hold of her, and she really at one point came close to death's door. And so it's this whole thing of when we're thinking, which knowledge bases do we tap into? And so I think it's about the knowledge base as to whether we overthink or not.
Right.
Can I just, go ahead. I'm thinking here about the impact on parts of our lives, right? So this issue of how it affects other parts of my life. So I'm thinking of myself as a father. And what comes to mind is, you know, sometimes you think things that are dangerous are brilliant. There's a kind of conflation there, but I find capitalism kind of stupid, right? And what I mean by that is it makes the mistake of sending us home. And so now you're in a caring territory. You have a problem because you can't commoditize that type of work. You could try, right? But now I am home and you want me to produce, but I also have my children to take care of. And I have to care for my family, right? So thought tells me, well, let me really consider how I spend my time between having to work or needing to work even, but having to care as real work as well, you know? And I think when you get on home's territory, you can't just control that space because, you know, it's not just a production for the sake of exchange. So I find there's a real reckoning here, you know, like a sharp relief capitalism comes into space with the home, you know, as a space that it tries to but can't yet, and I say yet because I think there's an onslaught, commoditize home.
Right.
You know, and so for me, that other aspect of life being, you know, when I'm not working for pay or working for wages, the work I do there takes a kind of thought that is a resisting thought to say, I need to do this, you know, and it becomes more of the case because it's a health issue that reinvokes the need to care. And I think that then makes this relationship between thought in a COVID context really, really pertinent.
Absolutely. And I'm going to leave it right there because I couldn't have summed it up better myself. Thank you all for joining me. Food for thought. I hope everyone's taken something inspiring, thoughtful away from this conversation. We'll see you next time on Breaking Bread. We're the Black Thought Collective. Until next time, one love.